New York, October 1970, the night the garden held its breath. New York in October does what it has always done. It pulls its collar up, leans into the cold and keeps moving, unbothered, relentless, eyes fixed on whatever comes next. Madison Square Garden rose from 7th Avenue the way it always has, without apology, without any interest in being admired. It was never built to be beautiful. It was built to hold something, the particular crackling energy that fills a space when thousands of human beings pack themselves together to watch other human beings push right up against the edge of what a person can do. That energy had been gathering since the afternoon. Ticket holders streamed in from the sidewalks, while scalpers worked the crowd outside, and vendors moved through the lines selling programs, each one carrying the photograph of two men who had spent months training in separate gyms, in separate corners of the city, for one singular purpose: to share a ring tonight and settle, in the oldest and most direct way human beings know, which of them was better. The marquee out front read Heavyweight Championship. In New York in 1970, nothing more needed to be said. Those two words pulled 20,000 people through the turnstiles, into the red velvet seats, into the standing room along the back walls, into the press rows at ringside, where journalists sat with their notebooks and the kind of professional detachment that holds up fine in theory and dissolves completely the moment the first real punch lands. The air inside the garden smelled the way it always smelled on fight nights: popcorn, cigarette smoke, and the warm collective tension of 20,000 people who had been waiting for something for weeks and could now feel in their chests the difference between waiting for it and being in the room where it's about to happen. Out on 7th Avenue, the October wind cut through the gaps between buildings with the practiced efficiency of a city that has been doing this for 100 years. Inside the garden, none of that existed. There was only the ring, the hard white light suspended above it, and the 20,000 people arranged in widening circles of anticipation around it, leaning in without quite realizing they were leaning. The man in the fourth row. Bruce Lee arrived at 7:15 and found his seat in the fourth row on the east side of the arena. He came alone. He had been in New York for 3 days on business that had nothing to do with boxing. A promoter he knew casually had handed him the ticket with a simple suggestion: "This one is worth seeing." Bruce had accepted without particular excitement. He had watched fights before. He understood boxing the way he understood every fighting system, not with sentiment, but with the cool, precise attention of someone who could look at any discipline and immediately identify its underlying mechanics, its principles, its strengths, and its limits, regardless of whether it matched his own approach. He settled into his seat with a stillness that set him apart from nearly everyone around him. Not the stillness of boredom, but the kind that belongs to a person who is genuinely capable of waiting, completely, comfortably, without the low-grade restlessness that crowds tend to produce in most people. The garden filled, the noise climbed, the preliminary bouts came and went, each one ratcheting the atmosphere a little tighter, and through all of it, Bruce Lee watched with the same expression: open, neutral, entirely present. To his immediate right, a retired postal worker from Brooklyn named Frank Ciccone had brought his grandson to his very first boxing match and was leaning in close, explaining the rules in a quiet, patient voice that drifted into Bruce's awareness without quite landing. 2 seats to his left, with one empty seat between them, sat Rosa Delgado. Best coat buttoned, hands folded neatly in her lap, her son's photograph tucked inside her purse. The main event was scheduled for 10 rounds, with the heavyweight championship belt on the line. Iron Jack Morales, the champion who had never lost. The champion's name was Jack Morales. Professionally, he was known as Iron Jack,
a nickname earned 7 years earlier when a sports writer watched him absorb 3 consecutive left hooks from a man who had knocked out 11 straight opponents, and saw Morales not only stay on his feet, but barely react. Iron, the writer decided, was the only word that came close. Morales was 31 years old. He had turned professional at 19, and in the 12 years since had built a record of 31 wins and 0 losses, 25 of them by knockout. That last number wasn't just a statistic, it was a description of how he fought. He stood 6'4" and walked into the ring at 220 pounds, a figure reached through a training regimen his own cornermen privately called inhuman, and that Morales himself described simply as the minimum required. He had held the heavyweight title for 3 years, and he held it the way men hold things they have bled for, with the quiet, immovable certainty of someone who understands that nothing was handed to them and nothing will be easily taken away. The challenger. His opponent that night was a 24-year-old fighter from the Bronx named Carlos Delgado. His record stood at 14 wins and 2 losses, and every serious boxing writer in New York had agreed on one thing: Delgado was the most credible threat Morales had faced since the night he won the title. Delgado was smaller than Morales and considerably less experienced, but he was faster, and in his corner stood a trainer named Eddie Vega, who had spent 18 months doing nothing but studying Jack Morales, watching footage, logging patterns, mapping tendencies, and believed with quiet conviction that he had found something. The fight was expected to be close. The crowd had paid serious money for exactly that expectation. At ringside, 3 of the most respected boxing journalists in the country sat with their notebooks already open, their predictions already written, and the practiced willingness to be completely wrong about all of them, which is ultimately what serious boxing journalism demands of a person. Eddie Vega arrived at the arena at 6 p.m. and spent 45 minutes walking the perimeter of the building before heading to the locker room. He had prepared his fighter for every scenario he could conceive. What happened at 8:45 was not one of them. The champion makes his entrance. 45 minutes before the main event was scheduled to begin, Jack Morales walked out of his locker room and headed to the ring. This alone was not unusual. Champions sometimes entered early to receive the crowd's welcome, to claim the space, to plant a flag. The ring as their territory, into which the challenger would later arrive as an intruder. It was a psychological move, and a familiar one. What was unusual was what he did when he got there. Morales didn't go to his corner. He stopped in the center of the ring, with both hands resting on the ropes, and looked out at the 20,000 people still settling into their seats. He wore his robe, white with gold lettering, Iron Jack across the back in capitals, and his championship belt was buckled around his waist over the top of it, not worn like a sporting accessory, worn like a crown. The deliberate, unhurried statement of a man who intends for everyone in the room to remember who holds what. He scanned the crowd, not casually, specifically. He was looking for something, and the people in the front rows could feel it. A small, cold discomfort moved through them as his gaze passed their section. Rosa Delgado. In the 4th row on the east side of the arena, 2 seats to Bruce Lee's left, sat a woman named Rosa Delgado. Her hands were folded in her lap, her back was straight, her best coat was buttoned to the collar. On her face was the carefully composed expression of a mother who has spent a lifetime teaching her son to be strong, and who is now sitting in the building where that strength is about to face the greatest test it has ever encountered. She was 68 years old. She had come from the Bronx on the subway. Her son's photograph was in her purse. She had attended every one of Carlos's 4 professional fights and had not missed a single one, and she had no intention of starting tonight. She did not know that Jack Morales was looking for her. She found out when he pointed. Morales leaned over the east side ropes and extended one thick finger directly at Rosa Delgado. He said something, loud enough for the front rows to hear clearly, readable by expression alone to those farther back. "That's Delgado's mother right there." He said it toward his cornermen, but he said it for the rows around her. Then he added, "She came to watch her son lose." He looked at Rosa as he said it. Rosa looked back at him. She did not look away. She was a woman who raised her son alone in the Bronx, buried her husband when Carlos was 11 years old, and worked 2 jobs for 4 years to keep a roof over their heads. She had not survived all of that by looking away from things. Morales held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, the look of a man who has located a pressure point and made the decision to use it. He should have gone to his corner. He had done what he came to do, made his entrance, claimed his space, delivered his message. His trainer had told him specifically, "Establish your presence, then prepare."
The expression that told everything. Something crossed Jack Morales's face, not quite recognition, but in the same neighborhood. The feeling of encountering something your instincts have already logged as dangerous before your conscious mind has had time to catch up. His trainer, watching from the corner, would say afterward that he had seen that expression exactly once before in 11 years. Briefly, 2 seconds in the 6th round of the Harrington fight, the one bout in which Morales had been genuinely, undeniably hurt. He had seen it, and then Morales had recovered and won. He had not seen it again until tonight. And tonight it had arrived not in the heat of a championship round, but 45 minutes before the opening bell, placed there by a man in street clothes who had climbed through the ropes without an invitation. 3 words. Bruce Lee said, "Get out of the ring." His voice was quiet. The arena had gone quiet enough that the front 20 rows heard every word. He was not addressing the officials. He was not talking to the cornermen. He was talking directly to Jack Morales. Morales stared at him. "Who are you?" Bruce Lee did not answer the question. "Get out of the ring and apologize to that woman." Morales looked at his cornermen. He looked at the ring officials. He looked at 20,000 people watching from their seats. He looked back at Bruce Lee, and he made a decision. It was the wrong decision, but it was the only decision that 31 years of never losing had prepared him to make, the decision of a man who has never once encountered a situation that his physical dominance could not resolve. He took a step forward. "You need to leave my ring, little man, before something bad happens to you." Bruce Lee watched the step. He watched the weight shift it produced. He read the positioning of the hands, the angle of the shoulders, the precise configuration of a man who has decided to end a problem with his body and is quietly organizing himself for that purpose. Bruce Lee had been reading men prepare for violence his entire life. He had seen this particular arrangement 10,000 times. He already knew what was coming, when it was coming, and exactly what he was going to do before it arrived. He gave Morales one final opportunity. Walk away. Morales did not walk away. 8 seconds. What happened next took approximately 8 seconds of real time. It would be described, debated, and analyzed for years by everyone who witnessed it. Morales threw a right hand, not his fight-ending punch, just the jab, the establishing shot, the punch a fighter throws to measure distance and gather information before committing to the serious work. It traveled toward Bruce Lee's face. Bruce Lee was no longer where his face had been. He had moved with the particular economy of someone for whom movement is not a reaction to an attack, but a permanent condition, a continuous state of being that the attack simply failed to intersect with. The jab found nothing. The absence of contact produced a fraction of a second of imbalance in Morales, a tiny involuntary overextension, and in that fraction, Bruce Lee hit him. The punch traveled 6 inches. It arrived at the solar plexus with a sound the front rows heard as a compression, a focused, dense implosion of force into a small and specific area.
a sound that was wrong in the way sounds are wrong when they signal that something has happened to a human body that a human body was not built to absorb. Morales stopped, the way a machine stops when something essential has been interrupted. For 1 second he was still standing. Then he was not standing. He went down in the center of his own ring in front of 20,000 people on the night of his championship defense without having been hit by a professional fighter, without having been hit by anyone who had ever competed professionally, without having been hit by anyone who weighed more than 145 pounds. He went down and he stayed down. The arena fell into a silence that 20,000 people produced together, the silence of witnesses who have just seen something they will spend the rest of their lives searching for the right words to describe. The nod. Bruce Lee stood over Jack Morales for a moment. Then he turned. He walked to the east side ropes and looked down at Rosa Delgado. She was sitting upright, a cloth pressed to a small cut above her eyebrow, her back straight, her hands steady, the bleeding already stopped, her eyes completely clear. She looked up at him. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. Then Bruce Lee nodded once. Rosa Delgado nodded back. It was a small, private exchange, intimate in its quality despite being witnessed by 20,000 people. The wordless understanding that passes between two people who have just shared something that language would only diminish. Bruce Lee stepped through the ropes, stepped down from the apron, walked back to his seat, sat down, straightened his jacket. Around him, the arena was slowly finding its voice again, climbing back up from silence through murmur, through sound, toward the full roar of 20,000 people beginning the process of turning what they had just seen into a story they could tell. Bruce Lee sat and watched the ring officials attend to Jack Morales and said nothing to the people around him who were urgently trying to say things to him. The journalist who couldn't write. In the press rows, 3 boxing journalists sat with their notebooks open and their pencils raised. None of them wrote anything for a long time. One of them, Gerald Harris, 14 years covering boxing for the New York Post, sat motionless in his press row for approximately 4 minutes after Bruce Lee returned to his chair before he put a single word on paper. He said afterward that the problem wasn't that he didn't know what he'd seen. The problem was that everything he'd seen had occurred in a category that 14 years of boxing coverage had never given him the language to enter. He eventually wrote 6 words at the top of his notes page. He kept that page for the rest of his career. He never published them. The fight that followed. Carlos Delgado came out for the main event 40 minutes later. His mother was still in her seat in the 4th row, back straight, hands folded, as if the evening had proceeded entirely as planned. The garden medic who treated the cut above her eyebrow had worked Madison Square Garden events for 9 years. He had treated cuts, fractures, concussions, and 1 cardiac episode. He said afterward that the 68-year-old woman in the 4th row on the east side was the calmest person he had ever attended to in 9 years of garden events, that she had sat perfectly still while he worked, thanked him when he finished, and turned back to face the ring as though nothing had interrupted her evening at all. She watched her son fight with the same steady composure she had arrived with. Carlos Delgado won the heavyweight championship that night by decision over 10 rounds against a champion who fought the entire fight with something missing from the center of his certainty. Something that had been quietly removed 8 seconds before the opening bell by a man in a black t-shirt who had come to the garden as a spectator and left as something that 20,000 people could not name but would not forget. Midnight on 7th Avenue. Bruce Lee left the garden at midnight. He walked out onto 7th Avenue and into the October cold, and the city moved around him the way it always does, indifferent, continuous, honest. He walked 2 blocks, hailed a cab, went back to his hotel, ordered room service, and went to sleep. Rosa Delgado went home to the Bronx on the subway with her son's championship belt in her lap the entire ride. She held it the way you hold something you waited a long time for. On the platform at her stop, before climbing the stairs, she stood for a moment and thought about the man in the black t-shirt who had stood up when no one else stood up, who had moved through 4 grown men like they were weather, who had climbed into a heavyweight champion's ring in street clothes, done what needed doing, then walked back to his seat and straightened his jacket. Rosa Delgado had never been to the Garden before. She did not know he was Bruce Lee. She did not know that he had come from Hong Kong. She did not know that he was already famous. She did not know that he would become a legend. She did not know that he would be dead in 3 years, that he would be buried in Seattle, Washington, a city she had only heard about in books. She did not know that by standing up for Rosa Delgado, he had set in motion a chain reaction that would end his life and make him immortal. She did not know that he would be so famous in her own country that millions of people who never saw him move would feel his presence in their own lives and would know his name as well as their own. She did not know that 8 years later, in 1978, she would hear his name said on television, in Spanish, in a Mexican supermarket, in a deli in the Bronx, while buying bread, and would remember the black t-shirt. All she knew was that a man had stood up for her, and for that, Rosa Delgado was forever grateful. She would be certain that her entire life could never have been lived if not for his courage. She did not know that millions of people would believe that their lives could never have been lived if not for his courage.